Regulating a company is actually a bit of a complex issue, and we've got to jump ahead to some of the material from week 10 to understand this. What we really have to understand is that a company or a corporation are a very specific type of legal entity. And it has two defining features. The first, it's actually considered a legal person. So the law makes a different distinction between a legal person and a natural person. And a company is considered a person by the law. That means it's legally different to the shareholders. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as the directors. It's not the same thing as the managers or the employees. It is actually the company, like a separate person who owns all of the property, who takes on the loans, who enters the contracts, right? So, for instance, if you're a shareholder, even if you own all the shares in a company, imagine you own 100% of the shares in a company, right? And that company buys a car, right? From a legal perspective, you can't go and just drive the car. You have no ownership in the car. The company owns the car, right? The company would have to allow you to use the car. Oh my God. Wouldn't you do that? Well, yes, like practically speaking, if you own all the shares, you can appoint whoever you want to be a director and they can say you can use the car. So why are you making such a big deal about this distinction if practically that's what's going to happen? Well, I think what we've done is used a practical example where it would happen. And a lot of the time, practically, this is what will happen. If you own 100% of the shares, yes, the company's generally going to do what you want, but it won't happen all the time. And to understand why, we need to understand this second kind of concept that we're dealing with, which is that of limited liability. So the second core attribute of the company is that the owners, now I put that in inverted commas because we'll come back to that in week 10. Are they really owners? But the shareholders or the owners of the company are not liable, right? They're not liable for anything other than the share price. Okay, so imagine that, I don't know, the car rolled down a hill and did $50,000 worth of damage to someone else. So the car does $50,000 worth of damage. Who has to pay the $50,000? The company, because it's their car. What happens if the company has $0? Well, the person who's injured cannot get the money from the shareholders. Why? Because the liability of the shareholders is limited to the value of the shares. So this raises a huge accountability problem. If the liability of the shareholders is limited, if the company does something wrong, just say it breaks a law, how is the company held accountable? Because you can't actually throw anyone in jail. It's the company, right? Now, there are some areas where you can fine the company, but really, if the reward's high enough, people might take that risk, right? And we don't want that. Because otherwise, anytime you did something dodgy or you wanted to do something dodgy, all you'd have to do is set up your own company, right? Set up your own company, do the dodgy thing. If you get caught, well, it's the company, not me. See the problem? This is the real problem around companies. Now, a lot of people argue companies aren't accountable enough, but we do have some accountability mechanisms in there. So why don't we look at what they actually are? So what we can see is because the company is a legal fiction, we can't really impose some constraints or penalties on the company itself. For instance, you can't send a company to jail. And really, it isn't the company that makes decisions. Right? Really, the people in the company make decisions. So the real problem is, how do we hold the people making the decisions accountable? Well, to understand how we do that, we need to understand this thing called the Constitution. So each company has a constitution. It's a kind of contract. It's actually called a statutory contract because it's in the Corporations Act, in a statute. And it's a contract between the members or the shareholders, the directors who are in charge, and management. So it's in Section 140 of the Corporation Act says that. Okay. And it can either be a separate document, or it can be a set of standard rules that are in the Corporations Act. These are the replaceable rules, right? So this is the standard contract. If you don't write your own constitution, if you form a company and don't write your own constitution, what will apply are the replaceable rules. Now you might ask, why are they called the replaceable rules? Well, they're the rules that apply to the company that you can replace if you write new rules. That's why. It's very simple. So what happens is, you form a company. If no one writes anything, all of the rules in the Corporations Act will apply. They're the replaceable rules. But you can replace any of them that you want to, or all of them. So you can set up your own agreement between the members and the directors and the managers. But most of the companies operate off the replaceable rules. There are a lot of deviations from that for specific circumstances, but these replaceable rules are quite important. And they're the kind of vanilla solution. So we'll concentrate on them. So you can see here that sections 130 and sections 140 give legal effect to this idea of a constitution and replaceable rules. Under the replaceable rules, so the rule that most often applies is that the business is to be managed by the directors. So what that means is that the directors make the decisions, not the shareholders. Notice also it's an S, directors. It's not a director. Well, there might only be one director in your company, but it's the board of directors as a group that actually make the decision. They exercise all the powers of the company. They're the ones who exercise the powers of the company. Sometimes some powers are given to the company, and that's where we'd have things like the AGM. So some things can only be changed by the members in general meeting. That would be things like changing these rules. But in terms of decision making day to day, the directors. Okay, so decisions of the company are made here. How to run the company is made by the shareholders. Now, in reality, directors then delegate these powers to managers, right? But ultimately, the power rests with them. They delegate it. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, but shareholders can't make the decisions? Yeah, that's exactly right. So you could have 100% of shareholders get at a meeting and say to the company, oh, we want you to, enter the market in Thailand. And the directors could say no. And the members could do nothing. Well, they could vote the directors out. But theoretically speaking, the members can't tell the company what to do. And that's super important. Because remember, what happens if the company does something wrong? Right? Well, the members or the shareholders have a limited liability. So, just imagine it was illegal to enter the Thai market. It's not, but imagine it was. And the company and the members say to the company, enter the Thai market. Right? And the company does it, and there's all these problems. Well, now you can't sue the members because there's limited liability. So we can't hold them to account. And if we can't hold them to account because of limited liability, we're not going to give them any power. That's why. That's why it's set up the way it is, right? So, look, this is a very broad generalization. If you know anything about law and shadow directors and all those kind of things, you're going to be finding flaws and lifting the veil. And look, they're very rare circumstances. What we want to understand here is the concept. The concept is members have their liability limited, so they don't have much power. They can only appoint the directors to look after their interests, and they can only change the rules of the game. If we actually want to hold people to account, it's the decision makers for what happens most of the time, which is the directors and the managers or officers. Officers, my God, officers, where did that term come from? Think about it. CEO, Chief Executive Officer. COO, Chief Operating Officer. CFO, Chief Financial Officer. These terms that we know every day spring from this legal position of officer or a very senior manager. So the very senior managers and the directors are the ones that the law tries to hold to account. If you go on and do any further studies around this area, you'll learn something called directors and officers' duties. And it's the standard, it's the regulation on what we expect of people in these positions. So that's the way we do it. We try and hold the directors and officers to account for the decisions that they make as this legal fiction takes action in the business environment. So putting all this together, what we see is that regulation in business, particularly of any business of any size, is very complex. You've got all these forces. We've got the company's constitution regulating what people do and who's accountable for what. We've got compliance. We've got what the government says you have to do. That regulates it. We've got stakeholders giving us expectations, corporate social responsibility, sustainability, SDGs. These expectations are put on companies. And then we've got what the company itself decides to do, its codes of conduct and policy. So there's this huge complex set of often overlapping expectations that are placed on companies operating in our business environment. And the truth of the matter is, for you personally, it's the same, right? Society has expectations that are on you. If you have a job or if you're in any social group, there are expectations on you coming from there. You have your personal decisions about what you want to do, right? So we're all subject to these forces trying to regulate our behavior into the future. So we've got these forces on us, these expectations from regulation. But how actually are we held to account? While there is accountability, how do we have to explain this? What are the actual mechanisms that are out there? That's the subject of the next topic that we're going to be looking at, the mechanisms of accountability.